Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Saleh. The history of our interaction with computers is fundamentally a history of language. Long before the first pixel was illuminated or the first mouse clicked, the architecture of these tools was being shaped by the linguistic structures of the human mind. And since the early days of interacting with computers, there was a debate that has defined interface design for over 40 years. And it is whether to select an object and then act upon it, noun, verb, or choose an action and then apply it to an object, verb, noun. And it's not merely a matter of technical preference or aesthetic style. It is a cognitive struggle rooted in how human beings conceive of the world, how we structure our sentences, and how we perceive our own agency within complex systems. Now, in the physical world, our interactions are dictated by the immutable laws of physics. These laws generally favor a noun-first approach. To throw a ball, one must first grasp the ball, noun selection, and then throw it, verb execution. The object must be focused upon or selected before the action can be defined or executed. But in the realm of spoken language, which is the primary tool of how we communicate and command, the structure is often reversed. English, a subject-verb-object language, frequently places the action before the object in imperative commands. Open the door. Eat your dinner. Delete the file. In these constructs, the action, or the verb, is the primary driver of the sentence. It is the catalyst that demands a target. When computer scientists in the mid-20th century began constructing the first bridges between human intent and machine execution, they inadvertently codified these linguistic structures into the very DNA of operating systems. The early command line interfaces, CLIs of the 1960s and 70s, were built almost exclusively on the verbal metaphor. They treated the computer as a servant to be commanded. The user, acting as the subject, issued an imperative verb to the machine. Print report.txt. This verb-noun model dominated the first epoch of computing. It was efficient, precise, and for those who knew the vocabulary, incredibly powerful. It was also abstract, requiring the user to maintain a mental model of the system's state, a map in their head, because the objects of interest, the files, the directories, and the data, were invisible until summoned by name. The revolution that occurred at Xerox PARC in the 1970s and later by Apple with the Macintosh in 1984 was a rejection of this verbal metaphor in favor of a physical one. By representing digital bits as visible objects, icons, windows on a desktop, interface designers shifted the paradigm to the noun-verb model. In this model, the user first selects the object, which is the file icon, and then chooses the action: delete, open, or copy. This video is the story of competing philosophies, the raw efficiency of the command line versus the discoverability of the graphical user interface, the precision of the verb versus the safety of the noun. These models battled for dominance in the 80s. They achieved an uneasy truce in the complex toolbars in the 1990s and 2000s. And now, the rise of AI and large language models is threatening to upend the established order, bringing the verb-noun paradigm back from the brink of obsolescence in a new, probabilistic form. The cognitive demand of the verb-noun CLI is defined by the distinction between recall and recognition. In a command line interface, or the CLI, the user must recall the vocabulary from long-term memory. They must know that remove is RM in Unix, del or delete in MS-DOS, or erase in a different system. They must remember the flags and switches that modify the verb. This reliance on recall creates a high barrier to entry. The blank slate of the CLI offers no affordances, no visual clues as to what actions are possible. A file does not look deletable. It is merely a string of text. Now, in contrast, recognition relies on visual cues. Seeing a button labeled delete or an icon for a wastebasket or a trash can allows the user to recognize the function without memorizing it. Recognition is cognitively cheaper than recall. And it is the difference between fill in the blank test, CLI, and the multiple choice test, the GUI. The GUI presents the answers or the available commands right on the screen. The user has to select the correct one. Now, while the GUI minimizes cognitive load for beginners, the CLI often wins on raw speed for experts. This trade-off can be quantified using the GOMS model: goals, operators, methods, and selection rules, which is a framework developed to calculate human performance in human-computer interaction. A specific derivative of GOMS, the keystroke level model, or the KLM, assigns time values to specific actions. And according to it, when the same task is examined at the level of expert performance, the outcome becomes clear. Deleting a file through a command line allows an experienced user to act in a single continuous flow. Recall the command, type it, and execute it almost instantly. The mental effort required to remember the command syntax is negligible once learned. The physical action is limited to rapid keystrokes. By contrast, a graphical interface requires the user to shift from keyboard to mouse, locate the object on screen, point to it, and perform a series of spatial actions before the deletion occurs. These movements are inherently slower because they are constrained by the human motor control system, and the result is that despite being more approachable and expressive for general users, or humane, graphical noun-verb interfaces impose a physical efficiency ceiling. This is why verb-noun command lines continue to dominate among developers and system administrators. The mode error is the scourge of the verb-noun interface. In a strict verb-noun system, the user initiates a command. If the user forgets that they are in command mode and tries to type a sentence, or if they mistype a target, chaos happens. Jeff Raskin identified the noun-verb interaction as a primary antidote to these errors. In the noun-verb system, the noun, or the data, is the persistent state. The user selects a paragraph of text. That selection is visible. It provides immediate feedback. And from the 60s to almost 1984, the screen was void, a blank slate waiting for instructions. What do you want me to do? The interaction was linear, unforgiving. If you misspell by a single character, the system does not guess it. It replies with a cold rejection. Bad command or file name, for example. The burden of precision lies entirely on the human, and the users of that era provided themselves with a vocabulary. Different kinds of commands on different kinds of operating systems. Later on, the verb-noun model offered a superpower that noun-verb interfaces struggle to match even today, which was abstraction and also batch processing. Because the nouns were text, they could be manipulated using patterns. The asterisk became a symbol of immense power. If we write delete *.txt in this single command, it will delete every text file in the directory. In a noun-verb GUI, the user would have to manually select every file and then delete it. The linguistic nature of the command line interface allowed for logical operations on the nouns. That command was almost programmatic. delete all nouns that end in .txt. This ability to address nouns by their properties rather than their location is a distinct advantage of the verb-noun linguistic model. Now, 1984 was different, because the shift from the command line to the graphical user interface is often told through the story of Steve Jobs' visit to Xerox PARC in 1979 and the myth around it. The reality is completely different, and the narrative is often dramatized. The technical transfer was real and specific. Apple adopted the WIMP paradigm of the windows, icons, menus, and pointers, that interface, and crucially codified the noun-verb interaction model as the standard for consumer computing. Apple did quite a lot of work on codifying this interface that they saw first on the Alto computer and specifically focused on the consumer aspect of it. Xerox PARC Star System was the first to fully articulate the physical metaphor. If a screen represented the desktop, then files must be paper documents. You do not call a piece of paper by name, you pick it up. This required a fundamental inversion of the interaction sequence. Now, when the Macintosh launched in 1984, it did not just suggest the noun-verb order. It enforced it with religious zeal. The Apple Human Interface Guidelines in 1987, which is a document that became a Bible for a generation of developers, were very explicit.
Menus are central to the noun-verb principle of the Apple desktop interface. The user first selects an object, noun, either on the desktop or in a window, then chooses from a menu the operation, verb, to be applied to this object.
This was the radical departure. If you went to the File menu without selecting an icon, the verbs open, print, and duplicate were grayed out. They were disabled. This was constraint-based design. The interface physically prevented the user from constructing a nonsensical sentence. You cannot open nothing. This shift had profound effects on user psychology because it encouraged exploration. In a command line, exploration is dangerous. Typing random commands can have catastrophic effects. In a noun-verb GUI, users felt safe clicking on objects to see what would happen, because the act of selection, noun, is usually benign. It is only the subsequent action, or the verb, that changes state. And that action usually requires a deliberate menu choice or confirming a dialog box. Now, this did not come without a price. As software became more complex, the purity of the Macintosh's noun-verb model began to fracture under the weight of features. By the late 1990s, productivity suites like Microsoft Office were everywhere. Microsoft Word 2003 had hundreds of buried commands in its menu structures. The problem was that while the nouns, text, images, or tables were visible on the page, the verbs were hidden in static lists. In File, Edit, View, Insert, Format, etc. To find the crop verb for an image, the user had to hunt through the Format menu, often guessing where it might be categorized. The recognition advantage of the GUI was failing because there were simply too many things to recognize. There were many solutions around that, and probably one of the most notable ones was in 2007. Microsoft introduced the ribbon interface in Office, a radical redesign that doubled down on the noun-verb paradigm by making the verbs dynamic and context-aware. The ribbon introduced contextual tabs. When a user selects a specific noun, for example, clicks on a picture on a document, the ribbon automatically spawns a new tab, Picture Tools. This interaction model is the ultimate expression of the noun-verb logic. The interface essentially says, I see you have selected a picture, which is a noun. Here are the specific verbs, like crop, rotate, effects, that are compatible with this noun. This reduced visual clutter and improved discoverability. Users didn't need to search for tools. The tools came to them based on their selection. However, the ribbon faced a massive backlash from expert users. Simply because experts had memorized the spatial location of commands or the keyboard shortcuts. By making the interface dynamic, Microsoft broke the expert's muscle memory. The expert user often prefers the stability of a static verb location, like knowing where the save command is, over the shifting sands of a contextual user interface. And this problem was only getting bigger. There's a tension between this floor of entry, helping starter users find tools, and the ceiling of performance, which is allowing experts to work blindly. There were different solutions. While the OS shell, like Finder or Explorer, and productivity apps, like Word and Excel, solidified around Noun-Verb, creative applications like Adobe Photoshop retained a strong verb-noun heritage, disguised as tools and available in the interface. For example, in Photoshop, if the user wanted to paint, the user clicks on the brush tool in the toolbar. This was a select tool, or a verb. Then, if the user wanted to apply it to canvas, which is the noun, the user drags the mouse over the pixels. This tool-based interaction is technically verb-noun. You pick a verb and apply it to a noun. But it differs from the command line interface because the verb is applied continuously and spatially. It suggests a fundamental split in domain requirements. Editing and management favors noun-verb, like select file and then move it. In creation or drawing, it favors the verb-noun. Select a pen and then draw. You cannot select the line you haven't drawn yet. You must pick the verb draw to create the noun. And that was the state until 2007. Continuous interface hacks and changes dancing around the verb-noun, noun-verb modes. After that, the introduction of the iPhone in 2007 and the explosion of touchscreens brought a crisis to the noun-verb paradigm. The mouse was a precision instrument that had two states: hovering, or pointing, and clicking, which is selecting. The finger has only one state: touch. On a desktop, you can click an icon to select it, which is a noun, without opening it, which is the verb. On a touch screen, a tap is usually interpreted as an activation, a verb. Tapping an app icon launches it. Tapping a list item opens details. How then do you perform a noun-verb operations like delete or move on a touch screen? Well, we had different solutions. On iOS and Android, we have the long press, which is press and hold, that distinguishes selection from activation. To move an app icon, you don't tap it. You hold it until it jiggles. This is a gestural mode. We also have the swipe. To delete an email in Mail app, you swipe left. This creates a hybrid interaction where the gesture is the verb applied directly to the noun. It is direct manipulation in its purest form, mimicking the physical act of pushing something aside. But even in the mobile world, we have competing philosophies. The Android way, for example, is the floating action button, which is verb-noun. Google Material Design introduced the fab, a prominent circular button that floats above the content, usually with a plus symbol. This is a strong return to verb-noun. The action is primary and global. It shouts "create new" to the user. The iOS way is the context menu, or the noun-verb. Apple largely resisted the fab. The interaction there is that you have to long press a notification, which is a noun, a menu appears, and you tap reply. This maintains the noun-verb purity but suffers from discoverability issues. Users often don't know that a long press will reveal options. The verbs are hidden behind the pixels of the noun. This era left us with a fragmented language. You have a preference and you go with it. Users now navigate a mix of direct manipulation, like swiping cars, or hidden noun-verb modes with a long press, or explicit verb-noun with a floating action button. The consistency of the 1987 Mac desktop is gone, and it's replaced by a vocabulary of gestures that must be learned through trial and error. Now, we have to keep in mind that most of what I spoke about was in the consumer world. The developer world staged a counter-revolution. They realized that complex systems, noun-verb menus, were too slow and too hard to navigate. They wanted the speed of the command line interface with the discoverability of the GUI. The breakthrough came with Sublime Text and was popularized by Microsoft's VS Code. It was the command palette, invoked by Command-Shift-B or Control-Shift-B. This interface is a modern verb-noun resurgence. You invoke the void, the user hits the shortcut, and the text box appears, which is the prompt. The command palette solves the recall versus recognition problem. With recall, you need to know roughly what you want. Something about Git, for example. With recognition, the system shows you the exact commands that match. For speed, it keeps the hands on the keyboard, exactly like a command line interface, but it provides the safety of the menu, like the GUI. It is arguably the most efficient interaction model for complex software today, effectively merging the two paradigms into searchable verb interface. It acknowledges that power users think in verbs and shouldn't be forced to hunt for them in nested noun menus. This command palette is key for our next phase, which is the AI paradigm shift. And this takes us to the arrival of large language models. Now, in large language models, a prompt is fundamentally a command. Write a poem about a robot. Generate an image of a sunset. This is command line 2.0, if you will. It shares command line interface characteristics, but with infinite capability, you can ask almost everything. Zero affordances. The empty text box gives no clue what is possible. This is why we see a lot of AI text boxes now supported with existing prompts or guidance text. One key thing about the CLI of AI is that it is probabilistic, not deterministic. If we had the command del or delete, it always deletes the file. Draw a cat produces a different cat every time. This variability introduces a new layer of complexity. The user is no longer an operator pushing buttons. They are a curator, guiding an unpredictable agent. The interaction is in conversational loops. You get prompt, which is a verb. You get a result, which is a noun. You get a critique or refinement, which is a verb, and a new result, which is a noun. This probabilistic nature of this new command line interface is what we're dealing with now through prompt engineering. And there are many, many new types of interfaces that are specifically coming out of this command line 2.0, if you will, and the command palette concept. We see it applied in different image and video generation apps and services, and we also see it in new types of modes in existing tools, like in Photoshop. Most of the design attempts in previous types of software was about reducing the distance between the user and the object. AI increases it. In direct manipulation, with dragging a file, the distance is 0. With the command line interface, the distance is low. You have to know the command. It's a one-to-one command-to-action mapping. In AI, organize my files as a prompt, the distance is very high. The command maps to a complex, opaque set of actions. We see that with agents sometimes. The paradox is that high semantic distance allows for more powerful actions, like batch organization, content generation, but it offers less control. The future of UI, I think, will be in managing this distance, allowing users to zoom in to direct manipulation for precision, which is the noun verb, and zoom up to AI command lines of sorts for the power of verb-noun. All of this shows us that the history of interaction design is not a linear progression from primitive text to advanced graphics. It's actually more complicated than that, and it's more of a pendulum swing between the linguistic power of the verb and the tangible safety of the noun. We spent the first 20 years mastering the verb or the command line, optimizing for expert speed and batch processing. We spent the next 30 years, from the 80s until almost 2024, perfecting the noun, which is the GUI, the touch, optimizing for learnability, safety, and discoverability. Later on, and with the rise of AI, we are witnessing a synthesis. The future interface will likely be an intent-driven, object-oriented model. Mouthful. This leverages the best of history. We have noun first for context and precision, avoiding AI hallucination or ambiguity about what to process, and then the verb comes second for power and flexibility, avoiding the limits of static menus that can't possibly list every graph type. And as we can see, we cannot argue for verb-noun and noun-verb as if it's a war. The victor is neither. The victor is a contextual conversation, pointing at something, which is a noun, and saying, do this, which is the verb. Jeff Raskin predicted that the humane interface is one that respects the user's locus of attention. Whether we point with a mouse, tap with a finger, or reference with a pronoun, this or it in a chat, the need to ground our actions in specific objects remains the anchor of human-computer interaction. The screen may change from green screen to 4K windows to AR overlays. The grammar remains. We are the subjects, and the data is the object. And the interface is the verb that connects us.